The morning sun filtered through the white lace curtains of the Martinez household, casting soft, dancing shadows across Sophia's tiny bedroom. She stirred awake at 7:15 a.m., her small body stretching beneath her pastel pink quilt adorned with images of princesses and castle turrets. At 3 years old, Sophia was a creature of routine and comfort, and this Saturday promised to be one of those magical days that children treasure forever. Her highlighted hair, a trait inherited from her paternal grandmother, splayed across her pillow like spun gold. Her favorite stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy Ears, was clutched tightly in one small arm, a companion she'd insisted on sleeping with for the past 14 months. Heard the gentle stirring of her daughter and smiled to herself as she prepared breakfast. She'd been awake since 6, unable to sleep despite working a double shift the previous day at Joseph's Hospital, where she worked as a surgical nurse. Motherhood had transformed her in ways she never anticipated. She found joy in small moments now, in the simplicity of making pancakes on a Saturday morning, in the promise of a full day spent with her children. At 34 years old, had learned that life's true treasures weren't found in material possessions or career achievements, but in these quiet, unassuming moments of domestic tranquility. By the time Sophia padded downstairs in her oversized Mickey Mouse t-shirt and mismatched socks, one purple with ducks, one pink with stars, the kitchen smelled absolutely divine. Had prepared a full breakfast spread: homemade buttermilk pancakes, fresh-cut strawberries, scrambled eggs, turkey bacon, and freshly squeezed orange juice. Sophia's eyes widened with undisguised delight, and she climbed onto her booster seat with enthusiasm that only a hungry 3-year-old could muster. Her brother, now 8 years old and in the 3rd grade, was already eating at the kitchen table, engrossed in a children's science magazine about dinosaurs. "Good morning, Princess," said, leaning down to kiss Sophia's forehead. She noticed, as she always did these mornings, how much her daughter was growing. Sophia would be 4 in just 3 months and wanted to savor every moment of her little girl's childhood. Time moved too quickly, she thought. Yesterday Sophia had been a newborn in her arms, and today she was already forming complete sentences and expressing complex opinions about everything from the color of socks to the order in which she wanted to eat her pancakes. After breakfast, announced the day's plan with theatrical flair designed to maximize children's excitement. "Today is a very special day," she declared, placing her hands on her hips dramatically. "We're going to have an adventure. First, we're going to make the yard look absolutely beautiful because Abuela is coming to visit next week, and she always notices how well we keep our garden. Then, if you're both very good, we might go to the ice cream parlor for a special treat." At the stage where he was becoming too cool for obvious enthusiasm, managed a genuine smile. Sophia, however, erupted into squeals of pure joy, flapping her tiny hands and bouncing in her seat. Ice cream, chocolate ice cream," she sang, creating a little melody that was as off-key as it was endearing. Couldn't help but laugh. This was what life was supposed to be about. This simplicity, this unconditional love, this perfect, untainted joy. Around 9:30 a.m., and Sophia ventured into the yard while settled into the living room with his tablet, watching an age-appropriate educational program about space and planets. The Phoenix heat was already beginning to build, that characteristic desert warmth that would eventually become oppressive by afternoon, but at this hour, it was still pleasant and energizing. Wore her favorite sundress, a simple blue cotton number with small white flowers, and had applied minimal makeup, pulling her dark hair into a practical bun. She wanted to be cool and comfortable while working in the yard. Sophia, already warmed up with breakfast and play, was dressed in her favorite outfit, the yellow sundress with cartoon butterflies that her grandmother had given her for her last birthday. The dress had pockets, actual pockets that Sophia considered one of its greatest features, and she continually reached into them as if surprised and delighted by their presence. Had braided her daughter's hair that morning with meticulous care, weaving colorful ribbons, pink, purple, and yellow, throughout the golden locks. Sophia felt like a princess, and had told her exactly that, which made the little girl stand a foot taller with pride. The Martinez household was located in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in central Phoenix. The homes were modest but well-maintained, the kind of neighborhood where families had lived for decades, where children played safely outside, and where neighbors waved to each other across their lawns. The Martinez's property was a quarter-acre lot with a small front yard and a more spacious backyard, had invested effort into creating a beautiful, welcoming space. She'd planted along the fence line, cultivated a small herb garden near the kitchen door, and maintained flower beds filled with vibrant zinnias, marigolds, and desert marigolds that thrived in Arizona's climate. Had planned to tackle several projects this morning. The flower beds needed weeding, new mulch had to be spread, and she wanted to plant some new perennials that she'd purchased from the local nursery the previous week. She'd prepared Sophia with age-appropriate gardening tasks. Sophia would help by watering the plants with a child-sized watering can, digging small holes with a plastic shovel, and arranging decorative rocks in pleasing patterns. In reality, Sophia would probably make more mess than progress, but that was the entire point. These were the memories being created, the moments that would shape how Sophia viewed nature, work, and spending time with her mother. As set up the garden workspace, spreading out tools, bags of mulch, and packages of new plants, Sophia hummed continuously. The song was from her favorite children's show, something about friendship and adventure and always trying your best. Found herself humming along, and together, mother and daughter created a sweet domestic symphony in their front yard. Sophia dragged her little watering can back and forth, splashing water on plants with enthusiastic imprecision. Some water actually reached the plants. Most of it ended up on Sophia's dress and sandals, which she found absolutely hilarious. The morning progressed with the kind of peaceful contentment that feels almost surreal in its perfection. Neighbors passed by on their morning walks and waved friendly greetings. Mrs. from 2 doors down called out compliments on how nice the yard was looking. An elderly man walked his golden retriever past their house, and Sophia waved enthusiastically, nearly dropping her watering can in her excitement. The dog, a gentle giant named Buddy, walked over to the fence, and Sophia petted him carefully while chatted with the owner about dog breeds and the weather. By noon, and Sophia had made significant progress. The flower beds were weeded, new mulch had been spread, and the new perennials were planted in strategic locations that would provide good color variation and blooming schedules. Sophia was dirty happy, and exhausted in that wonderful way that children get after good, honest play. Suggested they go inside for lunch and perhaps an afternoon nap before the day's remaining activities. Neither of them could have imagined that in just a few hours, the peace of this perfect Saturday morning would be shattered, and that the innocent joy of this day would be forever transformed into something else entirely, something that would require all their courage, resilience, and love to survive. The afternoon had settled into that drowsy, comfortable phase that only happens on lazy Saturday days. Inside the Martinez home, had managed to coax Sophia into a short nap, tucking her daughter under a lightweight blanket in her bedroom with Mr. Floppy Ears positioned just so. Sophia had protested with the characteristic stubbornness of a 3-year-old, but her body betrayed her exhaustion from the morning's outdoor activities. Within minutes of her head touching the pillow, her breathing had become slow and deep, her small chest rising and falling rhythmically. Stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep, that familiar surge of protective love washing over her. She whispered a silent prayer, something she did often, thanking the universe for this beautiful child and asking for her safety and happiness. Was in the living room, ostensibly doing his summer reading assignment, though suspected he was spending more time daydreaming than actually reading. At 8 years old, he was at that pivotal age where childhood was gradually giving way to pre-adolescence. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's thoughtful nature, combined with a quiet intelligence that his teachers consistently noted on his report cards. Was the kind of child who observed more than he spoke, who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders sometimes, had mentioned to her husband that seemed unusually serious lately, but had assured her it was just a phase, that all kids went through periods of introversion and deep thinking. Took advantage of the relative quiet to tackle the pile of laundry that had accumulated throughout the week. She'd started a load earlier, and now she transferred the wet clothes to the dryer, filling the small laundry room with the fresh scent of detergent and fabric softener. She folded clean clothes while listening to a podcast about parenting, something she did regularly, always seeking advice and perspectives on how to be a better mother. The afternoon light streaming through the laundry room window was golden and peaceful. She could hear the distant sounds of the neighborhood, several houses down, a child laughing somewhere nearby, the ambient hum of the city going about its Saturday routines. What couldn't hear, what nobody in the quiet Phoenix neighborhood could hear, was the chaos unfolding just 3 blocks away at Santos Corner convenience store on Camelback Road. At precisely 2:34 p.m., a man named, 37 years old with a history of violent felonies and substance abuse issues, had walked into the store with a gun concealed in his jacket pocket. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic. He was high on methamphetamine, a drug he'd been using sporadically for years but had recently become more dependent on. His financial situation had deteriorated rapidly over the past months. He'd lost his job, his apartment, and his custody rights to his 2 children. The gun had been obtained illegally from a contact in the underground network that thrived in Phoenix's underbelly. Had approached the counter where 62-year-old Santos, the store's owner and a well-respected community member, was standing. Without preamble, without warning, had pulled out the gun and demanded money. "Empty the register, now," he'd shouted, his voice cracking with desperation and drug-fueled adrenaline. Who'd owned the store for 23 years and had experienced a robbery once before in 1998, had remained relatively calm. He'd with the demands, not because he was afraid for his own life, though he was, but because he understood that material possessions meant nothing compared to human safety. He'd cleared the register of approximately $847 in cash, along with several lottery tickets from the stand. The entire robbery had taken less than 4 minutes. Had stuffed the money into a plastic bag and backed toward the door, the gun still raised and trembling slightly in his shaking hand. Had pressed the silent alarm button beneath the counter, a button he'd installed following the previous robbery, and remained perfectly still, hoping the police would arrive before the situation escalated further. However, had grown paranoid, likely sensing the tension in his posture or perhaps just reacting to the drug coursing through his system. He'd fired a single shot into the ceiling of the store, the sound absolutely deafening in the enclosed space. The bullet had lodged in a ceiling tile, leaving a small hole and a shower of white particles. No one was hit, but the psychological impact was significant. A customer who'd been in the back of the store browsing magazines had screamed, and the cashier, a 19-year-old girl named Jessica who worked weekends to pay for college tuition, had frozen in terror. Had then fled the store, running down Camelback Road with the plastic bag clutched in his hand. He'd veered into a residential neighborhood, disappearing between houses and jumping fences with the desperation of a man who understood the consequences of his actions. He had priors, 3 felony convictions for armed robbery, 1 for assault. This robbery, combined with his previous record, would result in significant prison time. Wasn't thinking rationally. He was thinking only about survival, about escape, about putting as much distance as possible between himself and law enforcement. The Phoenix Police Department's 911 dispatch center received the call at 2:47 p.m. The dispatcher, a 20-year veteran named Robert, processed the information with practiced efficiency. Armed robbery. Gunshot fired. Suspect fled on foot into residential neighborhood. Male, approximately 35–40 years old, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. Armed and dangerous. The information was immediately broadcast to all units in the area. Multiple patrol cars responded within minutes, converging on the neighborhood from different directions. Police helicopters were requested. The entire Central Phoenix district was put on alert. Officer James, Robert's younger brother, though they hadn't spoken in 3 years due to a family disagreement, happened to be exactly 1.2 miles from the Santos convenience store when the call came through. James had been conducting a routine traffic stop when the dispatch alert came across his radio. He'd immediately terminated the traffic stop and headed toward the robbery scene. James was 39 years old, with 8 years of experience in the K-9 unit. He'd been paired with Rex, his German Shepherd partner, for 5 years. Rex was not in the patrol car with him during the traffic stop. James had left him at the precinct while he handled some administrative paperwork related to a previous case. James had driven directly to the K-9 unit's facility, a decision made in consultation with his sergeant. This was an armed robbery with shots fired. A suspect on foot in a residential neighborhood meant danger not just to police officers but to civilians. Rex was the right tool for this job. The dog could track the suspect's scent, could apprehend if necessary, and could provide backup that no human officer could match. James had released Rex from his kennel. The dog immediately sensed the excitement in his handler's movements and had begun to vibrate with anticipation and eagerness. They'd driven to the neighborhood at 2:56 p.m., and by 3:04 p.m., they were beginning their search. Rex's nose went immediately to work, processing the complex tapestry of scents that filled the suburban landscape. Years of training had honed his abilities to an almost supernatural level. He could distinguish unique scent profile, the combination of sweat, methamphetamine residue, fear hormones, and the generic laundry detergent used by most people. The scent trail was strong, fresh, and recent. Rex began to move with purpose, his handler jogging beside him, communication headset active, regularly reporting their position and progress to the command center. Nobody, not Officer James, not Robert in the dispatch center, not the police captain coordinating the response, not Martinez folding laundry in her home, and certainly not Sofia Martinez sleeping peacefully upstairs, could have predicted that this armed robbery, this desperate criminal's flight, and this police response would intersect with Sofia's front yard in approximately 1 hour. The threads of fate were weaving together in ways that would soon become apparent, threads that would bind together a 3-year-old girl, a trained police dog, a hidden family secret, and a moment of truth that would change everything. The afternoon had progressed with deceptive calm, had finished the laundry, folded the last load of clothes, and placed everything in the family's respective baskets. She checked on Sofia around 3:15 p.m., finding her daughter still soundly asleep, her small face peaceful and serene, one tiny hand curled against her cheek. Mr. Floppy Ears had somehow migrated to the edge of the bed, but Sofia was still clutching the stuffed rabbit's ear, had smiled at the sight, that overwhelming rush of maternal love that sometimes caught her off guard with its intensity. She'd straightened Sofia's blanket, ensured the bedroom door was slightly ajar so she could hear if her daughter woke up, and had returned downstairs. Had abandoned his reading assignment in favor of building an elaborate structure with his Lego collection. The living room floor was covered with small plastic bricks in various colors, and had created what appeared to be a futuristic city with buildings, streets, and what he called a transportation system. He was deeply focused, completely absorbed in the creative process in the way that only children could achieve. Had brought him a small snack, apple slices with peanut butter and a glass of milk, and had asked about his project. Had explained it with characteristic enthusiasm, pointing out the various districts and explaining his architectural vision. Had listened intently, genuinely interested in how her son's mind worked, how he translated imagination into physical structures. By 3:47 p.m., had decided it was time to water the plants one more time before the intense afternoon heat made it inefficient. The flowers they'd just planted needed consistent moisture during their establishment phase, and she wanted to ensure they had a good foundation for survival through the Arizona summer. She'd changed into old clothes, a faded t-shirt and denim shorts, and had gathered her watering supplies. Sophia had woken up from her nap, groggy but cooperative, and had dressed her in her favorite yellow butterfly sundress again. Sophia had insisted on wearing it and hadn't had the energy to argue. The dress was already dirty from the morning gardening session anyway. They'd ventured outside around 3:55 p.m., just as the afternoon was beginning to shift into that late afternoon phase where the sun becomes more intense and the shadows grow longer. The temperature had climbed to approximately 94 degrees, and the heat radiating from the ground was beginning to become noticeable. Had set up near the front porch with a large plastic watering can, the kind with a curved spout that was easy to maneuver. Sophia had insisted on helping, and had given her the smaller plastic watering can, Sophia's version of the gardening tool, and together they'd begun their irrigation routine. Sophia had hummed that same song from her favorite children's show, the one about friendship and trying your best. She'd watered the plants with unsystematic enthusiasm, splashing water everywhere with complete lack of precision but boundless joy. Most of the water from her can had landed on the ground or her own pink flip-flops rather than on the actual plants, but hadn't corrected her. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about creating memories, about building a relationship with nature, about showing her daughter that taking care of things was important and rewarding. Had been in the middle of explaining to Sophia why some plants needed more water than others, a surprisingly complex concept for a 3-year-old, when she'd heard it. The sound had started faint and distant, a siren. Initially hadn't paid much attention. Phoenix was a city. Sirens were common occurrences throughout the day and night. Emergency vehicles were constantly responding to various situations across the urban landscape. The siren had drawn closer, however, growing louder and more insistent. Then another siren had joined it, and another. Had looked down at Sophia, noticing her daughter had stopped humming and was looking up at her with curious eyes. "Police cars," had said casually, trying to keep her tone light and reassuring. "There must be an accident or something nearby. Nothing to worry about, baby." She'd returned her attention to the watering, though something in her intuition had begun to prickle with mild concern. 3 sirens seemed like more than a typical accident response. The sirens had continued to approach, now clearly coming from the direction of the neighborhood's main arterial road that ran parallel to their street. Could see the blue and red lights beginning to reflect off the houses and trees several blocks away. Police vehicles had started appearing on the neighboring streets, some turning into alleys, others parking strategically at intersections. Had recognized the signs of a larger emergency response. A significant incident of some kind was unfolding in their vicinity. She'd made a snap decision. "Come on, Sophia. Let's go inside for a few minutes," she'd said, trying to keep any anxiety out of her voice. Sophia had protested predictably, clutching her small watering can as if it were a precious treasure. "But Mommy, the flowers need water," she'd argued, her lower lip beginning to quiver with the particular tragedy that only a 3-year-old could experience at being interrupted mid-activity. Had crouched down to Sophia's level, taking her small hand gently. "The flowers will be fine for a little while. Let's go check on your brother and get something cool to drink. It's very hot outside right now." She'd managed to coax Sophia toward the porch, though her daughter had dragged her feet in the exaggerated way of reluctant toddlers. They'd been about to step inside the front door when had heard the police radio chatter becoming increasingly urgent on the neighboring streets. She'd paused, listening, though she couldn't make out specific words. The tone, however, was unmistakable. Something significant was happening. Had decided to remain outside a bit longer, unwilling to lose sight of the situation. She'd settled Sophia onto the porch steps with a juice box and a small container of crackers, creating a temporary entertainment setup. Sophia had been by the snack and had begun consuming her crackers with focused determination. Had remained standing, watering can still in hand, watching the police activity with growing concern. Then, around 4:03 p.m., everything had accelerated dramatically. Two more police vehicles had turned onto their street, their sirens blaring at full volume. Officers had begun positioning themselves strategically throughout the neighborhood, had recognized this as a full search operation. They were looking for someone. Her heart had begun to beat faster. She'd pulled Sophia closer, keeping her hand on her daughter's shoulder protectively. And it was at exactly 4:07 p.m. that Rex's powerful German Shepherd nose had caught the scent trail leading directly toward the Martinez family's yard. Officer James had been jogging beside him, communication headset active, reporting their movements to the command center. The armed robbery suspect had jumped 3 residential fences and cut through 2 yards, his desperation overriding any sense of caution or direction. He'd been running blindly, simply trying to escape, unaware that his trajectory was taking him directly toward a small girl in a yellow butterfly dress and her worried mother. Had heard the sound of someone running through the yard behind their house, the distinct sound of footsteps pounding on hard ground, branches being pushed aside. She'd instinctively pulled Sophia closer, though she couldn't yet see what was causing the commotion. The sound had grown louder, closer, more frantic. Her protective instincts had shifted into high alert. Suddenly, Officer and Rex had appeared at the corner of their fence, the dog's powerful muscles straining against the lead, his focus absolute, his training overriding everything else. Time had seemed to slow down. Sophia had frozen, her juice box suspended halfway to her mouth, had frozen beside her, her mind struggling to process what was happening. The dog, this enormous, powerful, focused police K9, had locked eyes with Sophia. Everything had changed in that single moment. The perfect Saturday had shattered like glass. The protected bubble surrounding the Martinez family had been pierced, and nothing would ever be the same again. The moment stretched like taffy, each microsecond feeling like an eternity. His mind went completely blank, then flooded with primal instinct. She saw the massive German Shepherd rounding the corner of their fence, its muscular body moving with explosive power. She saw Officer jogging behind, his hand gripping the lead. She saw the dog's eyes lock onto Sophia with laser-focused intensity. Every maternal alarm bell in its body began screaming simultaneously. "Sophia, get inside, now," had screamed, her voice reaching a register she didn't know she possessed. The scream had contained all the fear, all the protective fury, all the desperate urgency of a mother whose child was in immediate danger. She dropped the watering can. It had clattered to the concrete porch with a hollow plastic sound that seemed incongruous with the terror of the moment. Her hands had reached for Sophia with an almost violent urgency. Sophia, who had been peacefully sitting on the porch step with her juice box, had frozen completely. At 3 years old, she had no context for understanding the danger. She'd seen Officer and Rex in that split second before her mother's scream, and something in the dog's intensity had registered in her young mind as significant, though not necessarily dangerous. She'd been too young to truly understand fear, but her mother's scream, that had registered perfectly. She'd understood in the wordless way that children do, that something was very wrong. Officer's heart had seized in his chest. In 5 years working with Rex, in 8 years as a police officer, he'd experienced few moments of genuine panic. This was one of them. He could see the child. He could see the frantic mother. He could see the trajectory of his dog, the pure focus of an animal following training and instinct. He'd immediately shouted with all the authority his voice could command, "Rex, stay, stay." Rex had hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, that infinitesimal pause where training warred with instinct. The dog's body had remained tense, his focus still locked on Sophia, but he'd slowed slightly. Officer had been pulling back on the lead with all his strength, his feet digging into the ground for traction. Every muscle in his body had been working against the 4-year-old dog's momentum. "Stay, Rex, stay," he'd commanded again, his voice sharp and authoritative. Had reached Sophia in those precious microseconds, scooping her daughter up with a strength born of pure adrenaline. Sophia's juice box had gone flying, exploding against the porch and leaving a sticky residue that seemed to mock the seriousness of the moment. Had cradled Sophia against her chest, spinning toward the front door with survival instinct overriding all other considerations. She'd been on the verge of screaming again when she'd heard the radio chatter. "All units suspect in yard at 4327 Camelback Avenue," a voice had crackled through officer's headset. "K9 unit has made visual contact. Suspect is armed and dangerous. Backup units en route." Officer had had maybe 3 seconds to process this information, to understand that they'd cornered the robbery suspect in a residential yard, that there was a civilian, a small child and mother, in immediate danger. He'd been fighting with Rex, who had shifted his focus slightly, his training reasserting itself. The dog could sense his handler's anxiety, could sense that the situation had changed. Something was wrong. Additional police vehicles had begun converging on the street, had heard the sounds, doors slamming, officers shouting commands, the distinctive click of tactical equipment. She'd finally made it inside the house, slamming the front door behind her and immediately locking it. Sophia had begun to cry, confused and frightened by her mother's terror, though she didn't fully understand what had terrified her mother so completely. Had appeared at the top of the stairs, his Lego city abandoned, his small face pale with sudden understanding that something catastrophic was occurring. "What's happening?" he'd asked, his 8-year-old voice small and uncertain. "Mommy, what's wrong?" "Inside now," had instructed, her voice still shaky with adrenaline. She'd herded both children toward the kitchen, away from the front windows. She could hear officers outside shouting commands, could hear the distinct sound of police radios, could hear what sounded like someone running through neighboring yards. She'd pulled both Sophia and close to her, holding them as if she could physically protect them from whatever was happening outside their walls. Outside, the situation had escalated rapidly. Officer had managed to get Rex under control, though the dog had remained intensely alert. Had emerged from behind a neighbor's shed approximately 50 yards away, the stolen money still in his hand, the gun visible in his other hand. He'd seen the police activity, had understood in that moment that he was cornered. Multiple officers had begun advancing toward him, their weapons drawn but held in ready positions rather than directly aimed. An officer with a megaphone had shouted, "Put down the weapon, drop the gun, put it on the ground now." Had appeared confused, disoriented, still riding the methamphetamine high that had propelled his desperate flight. His eyes had darted between the advancing officers, looking for escape routes. For a moment, one terrible moment, the situation had balanced on a knife's edge. The possibility of violence had hung in the air like a physical presence. Then Officer had made a calculated decision. He'd secured Rex to a fence post, ensuring the dog wouldn't interfere, and had advanced slowly toward, his hands held in a non-threatening position, his voice calm and measured despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I'm Officer," he'd said, his voice steady and professional. "I need you to put down the gun. You're surrounded. There's no escape here. But if you cooperate, if you put down that weapon right now, this doesn't have to get worse. Your choice, man. Put down the gun." The moment had lasted approximately 43 seconds, though it had felt like hours. Had stood there, the gun trembling in his shaking hand, his breathing rapid and erratic. His eyes had been wild, the pupils dilated almost completely. Around him, officers had remained perfectly still, weapons ready, waiting for his decision. Inside the Martinez house, had been holding her children, her heart pounding so hard she'd thought it might burst from her chest. Sophia had been crying softly, confused and frightened. Had been silent, his young mind trying to comprehend what was happening. Had been praying, silently, desperately, with an intensity that surprised even herself. She'd been praying for the police officers outside. She'd been praying for her children's safety. She'd been praying that whatever this was, it would end without tragedy. And then, finally, after what had seemed like an eternity of suspended time, had dropped the gun. His shoulders had slumped in defeat. His knees had buckled slightly. Officers had surged forward, securing him with professional efficiency, reading him his rights, securing the weapon. The immediate danger had passed. But as it held her children in the kitchen of her home, she hadn't felt relief. She'd felt something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. Her daughter's "help me" comment earlier, the way Sophia had said it in such a matter-of-fact tone, had been nagging at her subconscious. Sophia hadn't been afraid when the dog had appeared. She'd simply stated those two words. Why? The question had begun to burrow into his mind, demanding answers she wasn't yet ready to face. The police activity outside had gradually decreased in intensity over the next 30 minutes. Officers had secured in the back of a police vehicle. Ambulances had arrived, though had refused medical attention despite the obvious signs of drug use and minor cuts from jumping fences. Crime scene investigators had begun processing the area, documenting the suspect's path through the neighborhood. Neighbors had emerged from their homes, clustering in yards and on porches, discussing what they'd witnessed with the kind of excited concern that catastrophes always generate in communities. Had kept Sophia and sequestered inside the house, away from the chaos visible through the windows. She'd given Sophia a small glass of milk and some cookies, trying to calm her daughter's lingering anxiety. Sophia had recovered remarkably quickly from her initial fear, though she remained clingy and insisted on staying close to her mother. Children, had reflected, possessed a resilience that sometimes astonished adults. Within minutes of the immediate danger passing, Sophia had returned to something approximating her normal demeanor, though she occasionally looked toward the windows with cautious curiosity. Had been different. At 8 years old, he was old enough to understand that something serious had occurred, though not necessarily old enough to process all the implications. He'd asked repeated questions about police procedures, about why the man had a gun, about whether their house was safe. Had answered as honestly as she could while trying to keep him calm and reassured. She'd finally set him up in the living room with his tablet, selecting educational content that would occupy his mind and help him decompress from the adrenaline spike. Around 4:45 p.m., had heard a knock on the front door. She'd been immediately tense, her protective instincts still in overdrive, but she'd recognized Officer James through the peephole. She'd opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged initially before recognizing his uniform and professional demeanor. "Mrs. Martinez," Officer had asked, his voice gentle and professional. "I'm Officer James, K-9 Unit. I wanted to check on you and your family after that situation. Are you all okay?" Had unlatched the chain and opened the door fully. "Yes, we're fine, just shaken up," she'd said, her voice still trembling slightly with residual adrenaline. "Thank you for handling that so quickly." Officer had nodded understandingly. "I'm sorry your family was caught in the middle of that. It wasn't the typical Saturday afternoon, I'm sure. Is everything okay inside? Did your daughter get frightened?" The question had been routine, part of his standard check-on protocol for civilians involved in police incidents. But something in the way he'd asked it, combined with his own nagging unease about Sophia's strange words, had caused her to pause. "Actually," had said slowly, "Sophia said something strange when she saw your dog. She said, help me." Officer's expression had shifted subtly. He'd been trained to notice inconsistencies, to recognize when something didn't fit the expected pattern. A 3-year-old saying, "help me," to a police dog during a routine police action was unusual. "She said that," he'd asked gently. "Did she seem frightened of the dog?" Had shaken her head, realizing now what had been bothering her about that moment. "No, that's the strange part. She wasn't screaming or crying. She was completely calm. She just said it like she was waiting for someone to help her." Officer had maintained a carefully neutral expression, but something in his professional training had activated. He dealt with enough domestic situations, enough complex family dynamics, to recognize potential warning signs. "Mrs. Martinez, I don't want to overstep, but can I ask, Has everything been okay at home? Have you noticed anything concerning about Sophia's behavior? His face had gone pale. The question had struck something deep, something she'd been avoiding consciously but processing subconsciously. She'd stood there in the doorway, her hand still on the door frame, and something had clicked into place in her mind. A series of small observations had suddenly arranged themselves into a coherent, horrifying pattern. Sophia had been increasingly withdrawn over the past weeks. Sophia had started flinching when touched unexpectedly. Sophia had been having nightmares, waking up screaming several times a week, had attributed it to normal childhood anxiety, to growing up, to developmental phases that all children went through. But now, standing in her doorway, looking at Officer's concerned expression, she'd begun to understand that she might have been in denial. I had started, her voice breaking. She'd looked back into her house, toward the living room where was sitting with his tablet and toward the kitchen where Sophia was eating cookies. I need to. There's something I need to talk to my husband about. But yes, I've noticed some changes, I thought. I didn't want to believe. Officer had maintained his professional composure, though his internal alarm bells were now ringing loudly. Is there anyone else living in your home? Anyone who has access to your children when you're not here? Had felt her knees weaken. Her brother, of course, who'd been living with them for nearly a year after his divorce, who'd been struggling financially and emotionally, whom she'd trusted completely because he was family, who'd been home alone with Sophia on numerous occasions while worked her shift at the hospital. Who? My brother, had whispered, the words seeming to come from somewhere outside herself. My brother has been staying with us. He watches the kids sometimes. Officer had nodded slowly, his expression becoming even more serious. Mrs. Martinez, I think you should call Child Protective Services. I think you should tell them what you're suspecting. And I think you should contact your husband immediately. This needs to be documented by the proper authorities. I can provide you with contact information if you need it. Had felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The implications of what Officer was suggesting, the implications of Sophia's simple 2 words, the implications of all those small behavioral changes she'd been ignoring, it had all crashed down on her simultaneously. She'd gripped the door frame to steady herself, feeling physically ill. Oh my God, she'd whispered. Oh my God, I've been so stupid. I should have known something was wrong. Officer had stepped slightly closer, his voice gentle but firm. You're not stupid, Mrs. Martinez. This isn't your fault, but you need to act now. You need to protect your children. Do you understand? Had nodded numbly. She'd managed to thank Officer, though she'd barely heard her own voice. She'd closed the door and had stood in her living room, her entire body shaking, her mind cycling through a year of memories, trying to determine when everything had become so wrong, when she'd failed to protect her children. That's when Sophia had toddled over, sensing her mother's distress, and had looked up with her innocent eyes, and had broken completely. She'd scooped Sophia into her arms and held her, weeping silently, finally understanding what those 2 words really meant. Sophia hadn't been afraid of the dog. Sophia had been reaching out to authority, to safety, to the first person who represented protection and power strong enough to help her. Had looked toward the kitchen clock, 4:52 p.m. on Saturday afternoon. Her entire family's life had changed irrevocably in the space of an hour. She'd known, with absolute certainty, that nothing would ever be the same again. By 5:17 p.m. had called her husband at work. She'd barely been able to speak through her tears and shock. By 5:45 p.m. had arrived home, his face ashen as had explained what Officer had suggested. By 6:30 p.m., they'd made the first call to Child Protective Services. By 7:00 p.m., a different kind of investigation, one that would be far more personal and devastating than the police manhunt that had preceded it, had officially begun. By Sunday morning, the Martinez household had transformed into a place that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. Had barely slept, cycling between anger, grief, and an almost paralyzing sense of failure as a father. Had woken at 3 a.m. and hadn't been able to return to sleep, her mind replaying memories, searching for evidence she should have seen, evidence she'd somehow missed or rationalized away. Child Protective Services had completed an initial home visit late Saturday evening. Sophia had been examined by a pediatrician trained in trauma assessment. Mandatory reports had been filed with law enforcement. The machinery of the system, once activated, had begun its inexorable movement forward. Sophia had remained relatively calm through most of the procedures, though she'd clung to with an intensity that broke her mother's heart. The pediatrician had found physical evidence consistent with abuse, bruising in various stages of healing, signs of emotional trauma, behavioral indicators of chronic stress. The doctor's report, delivered with professional compassion but also with undeniable clarity, had confirmed her worst fears. Her daughter had been suffering, and she'd been too blind, too trusting, too willing to accept simple explanations to recognize it. Sunday afternoon, a trauma-informed investigator named Detective Maria had come to the house to conduct formal interviews with both children separately, and had been instructed to maintain normalcy as much as possible while also preparing the children for the interview process. It was an impossible balance. How do you tell an 8-year-old and a 3-year-old that their world is about to be dissected by the legal system? Had been called into the living room first, where Detective had set up a comfortable, non-threatening interview space. She was a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and decades of experience interviewing traumatized children. She'd explained that she needed to talk to him about some things, and that it was very important that he tell her the truth, even if the truth was scary or sad or made him feel bad. Had sat on the couch next to Detective, his small body rigid with anxiety. His 8-year-old mind had understood on some fundamental level that this conversation was pivotal, that his words would determine what happened to his family, what happened to Sophia, what happened to Uncle. He'd been carrying this secret for so long, bearing this burden in complete silence, that finally having permission to speak it had opened a floodgate. "I knew something was wrong," had begun, his voice trembling. "Uncle, when Mom wasn't home and you were at work, Dad, Uncle used to make Sophia cry. He would take her into the bedroom and close the door, and I could hear her crying. When he came out, he'd tell me not to tell anyone, he said. He said if I told, social workers would take both of us away. He said Sophia would get taken away, and I would get taken away, and we'd never see each other or Mom and Dad again." Detective had maintained her calm, professional demeanor, while her internal rage at this man's manipulation and abuse had burned intensely. "What did you do when you heard Sophia crying?" she'd asked gently. Had begun to cry, his shoulders shaking with the emotion he'd been suppressing for months. "I couldn't do anything. He's bigger than me. He's older. What could I do? I wanted to stop him, but I was scared. I was scared of what he'd do to me, and I was scared that if I told someone, they'd take Sophia away. So I did the only thing I could think of." Detective had leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "What did you do?" "I taught her," had whispered. "I taught Sophia 2 words. I told her that if she ever saw a police officer or any grown-up who looked like they could help, she should say those words. I practiced with her over and over. Help me, help me, help me. I made her say it every day. I didn't know when it would happen, but I knew that someday, somehow, someone would be there who could actually help her. Someone with power, someone who wasn't afraid of Uncle." Detective had felt tears forming in her own eyes, a rare occurrence in her 2 decades of investigative work. This 8-year-old boy had orchestrated a rescue for his sister with the intuitive genius that only a desperate child in an impossible situation could summon. He'd understood, at some level that transcended his years, that his sister needed to reach out for help, and that his role was to prepare her for that moment. "That was very brave," Detective had said, and she'd meant it with absolute sincerity. "You protected your sister the best way you could. That wasn't your responsibility. That was the responsibility of the adults around you. But you were incredibly brave, and what you did may have saved Sophia's life." Had continued to cry, but something in his body had relaxed slightly. He'd finally been released from the burden of carrying this secret alone. He'd unburdened himself to someone in authority, someone who could actually do something about it. Over the next 30 minutes, had provided a detailed account of the abuse he'd witnessed. Specific dates when he'd heard Sophia crying. Specific comments had made. Specific threats had issued. Specific behavioral changes in Sophia that had observed. The detective had asked follow-up questions with careful precision, building a timeline of abuse that had apparently been occurring with increasing frequency over the past 10 months. When detective had finished she'd sat with and in the kitchen while returned to his room, emotionally exhausted. She'd looked directly at both parents, her expression grave. "Your son is an extraordinary child," she'd said. What he did, coaching his sister to reach out for help, that took more emotional intelligence and courage than most adults possess. He literally saved his sister's life by ensuring she would recognize and reach out to authority figures. That police dog was the perfect catalyst because it represented safety, power, and authority all at once. Sophia's 2 words weren't random. They were the product of her brother's months of preparation, and his deep love for her. Had broken down again, though this time it was combined with a complex mixture of grief and overwhelming pride in her son. Had wrapped his arm around his wife, his own eyes wet with tears. Detective had then conducted her interview with Sophia, though the 3-year-old's account had been fragmented and difficult to interpret. At Sophia's age, language was still developing, and trauma had further complicated her ability to articulate her experiences. However, when detective had asked Sophia about Uncle, Sophia had become quiet and withdrawn. When asked if Uncle had ever hurt her, Sophia had nodded silently. When asked to show where it hurt, Sophia had pointed to various parts of her small body, her arms, her legs, her bottom, areas consistent with physical abuse. By Sunday evening, detective had completed her preliminary investigation, had been arrested at his workplace Monday morning. Prosecutors had filed formal charges of child abuse, aggravated assault, and endangerment. The evidence had been overwhelming and undeniable. But as had looked at her 2 children that Sunday night, who had borne an impossible burden with courage and love, Sophia, who had finally been heard and believed, she'd realized that the legal victory, while necessary and important, was only the beginning. The real work, the real healing, would be far more complex and lengthy. Her children had been traumatized. Her family had been shattered. And while justice was now in motion, it could never undo what had been done. Yet there was something else too, something that glimmered beneath the devastation. Selfless love for his sister, Sophia's resilience. The fact that they had found each other, had protected each other, had ultimately survived. The family had been broken, yes, but perhaps with time and help and love they could become whole again, not the same as before, but whole nonetheless. The weeks following his arrest were a labyrinth of legal procedures, medical appointments, and psychological evaluations. The Arizona Department of Child Safety had initiated a comprehensive investigation into not only his conduct, but also into how the abuse had gone undetected for so long. Questions hung over the Martinez family like a storm cloud. Should they have known? Could they have prevented this? Were they, in some way, complicit through negligence or inattention? Detective Maria had become the primary investigator for the case against. She'd interviewed neighbors, teachers, providers, and healthcare workers. What emerged was a pattern of concerning behavior that had been noticed by various people, but never reported or connected into a coherent picture. Mrs., the neighbor from 2 doors down, reported that she'd heard a child crying late at night from the Martinez house on multiple occasions over the past year. She'd assumed it was normal childhood upset and hadn't wanted to interfere in another family's business. The pediatrician who'd seen Sophia for routine checkups had noted some behavioral anxiety, but had attributed it to normal childhood development. Sophia's preschool teacher had observed increased withdrawal and flinching, but hadn't documented her concerns formally. The systemic failure was undeniable and became increasingly apparent as detective pieced together the timeline. Sophia had been seen by 3 different healthcare providers in the past year. None of them had communicated with each other. None of them had noticed the cumulative pattern of concerning signs. A child had been suffering in plain sight, and the systems designed to protect children, the medical system, the educational system, the community, had all failed in their fundamental responsibility. Prosecutors, led by Assistant District Attorney Helena, had begun building their case against. The evidence was overwhelming. Detective had compiled physical evidence, medical documentation of Sophia's injuries, photographic records, witness statements. She'd secured security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera that showed entering and exiting the house on multiple occasions when was known to be working. She'd interviewed his ex-wife from his previous marriage, who'd revealed a disturbing pattern. Had been accused of inappropriate behavior with his during that previous marriage, though no formal charges had been filed at that time. The accuser had eventually agreed to drop the matter in exchange for a financial settlement and custody arrangements that kept her children away from. This previous accusation was crucial. It established pattern and predilection. It demonstrated that this wasn't an isolated incident, but rather a pattern of behavior spanning years. It revealed that had been deliberately placed in situations with access to vulnerable children despite his prior history of concerning conduct. Criminal proceedings against moved with surprising speed, propelled by the clarity of the evidence and the seriousness of the charges. Charges were filed in Arizona Superior Court. 1 count of child abuse resulting in serious bodily injury, a felony, 3 counts of aggravated assault on a minor, felonies, and 1 count of child endangerment, felony. Each count carried potentially substantial prison time. Prosecutors pursued the most serious charges available under Arizona law, sending a clear message about the severity of the crimes. Initially maintained his innocence, his defense attorney filing preliminary motions challenging evidence and seeking bail. However, as prosecutors presented the medical evidence, detectives' investigative findings, and the videotaped statements of Sophia and his defense began to crumble. The combination of physical evidence, corroborating witness testimony, and the children's statements created an almost insurmountable case for the defense. During this same period, and faced their own investigation by the Arizona Department of Child Safety. While they were not suspects in the abuse itself, they were under scrutiny as parents who had failed to recognize or prevent the abuse occurring in their home. Social workers conducted home visits, interviewed the parents extensively, and evaluated their parenting practices. The process was painful and humiliating. Particularly struggled with the implication that she should have somehow known, despite deliberate deception and manipulation. Social workers did eventually determine that and had been victims of deliberate deception and manipulation. They had not knowingly allowed abuse to occur. They had not been negligent in a way that suggested they were unfit parents. However, the investigation did recommend mandatory parenting classes focused on recognizing warning signs of abuse, and it recommended that both parents undergo individual therapy to process their trauma and guilt. Sophia began working with Dr. Jennifer, a pediatric psychologist specializing in trauma. The 3-year-old had survived the abuse physically, but the psychological wounds required careful, specialized treatment. Doctor used play therapy, art therapy, and age-appropriate language to help Sophia process her experiences and begin to heal. Sophia's nightmares gradually decreased. Her flinching response to unexpected touch slowly improved. She began to smile more frequently, though there remained a wariness in her young eyes that hadn't been there before. Underwent more intensive therapy with Dr. Robert Martinez, no relation to the family, a child psychologist who specialized in siblings of abuse victims and children who had witnessed trauma. His case was complex. He hadn't been the direct victim of physical abuse, but he had been victimized through psychological manipulation and the burden of knowledge he'd been forced to carry. He'd been threatened with family separation to ensure his silence. He'd lived in fear and helplessness while his sister suffered. Dr. Martinez worked with on processing his guilt, the irrational feeling that he should have done more, should have risked telling an adult sooner, should have been able to protect Sophia more effectively. It was work that would extend far beyond that first year. Trauma, Dr. Martinez explained to Anne, was not something that could be cured in a few months of therapy. It was something that children learn to integrate into their understanding of the world, to process and move through over years. By August, nearly 9 months after that fateful Saturday afternoon, pleaded guilty to all charges. He understood that trial would only extend Sophia and trauma as they would be required to testify. He understood that the evidence against him was insurmountable. He also understood that his defense attorney had advised him that a jury trial, given the nature of the charges and the evidence available, would likely result in maximum sentencing rather than any mercy from the court. In September, appeared before Judge Robert Harrison for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with family, advocates, and support personnel. Sophia and had chosen not to attend. Their therapists agreed that witnessing's formal sentencing might them rather than provide closure. However, and attended, sitting in the front row, their faces etched with the pain of the past year. Judge Harrison listened to victim impact statements from Anne. He reviewed the extensive investigation report. He considered prior history, his complete lack of remorse, and the severity of his crimes against a defenseless 3-year-old child. The judge's expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the evidence and testimony. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "Mister, you have committed heinous crimes against a child who could not protect herself. You exploited the trust of a family. You manipulated and threatened a child who tried to protect his sister. You demonstrated predatory behavior that extends back years. This court finds you guilty of all charges and sentences you to a total of 15 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 12 years. The sentence was substantial but fell short of the potential 25 years that the charges could have carried. Some would argue it was too lenient for the severity of the crimes. Others would argue that no sentence could ever be adequate compensation for what Sophia had endured. Regardless, would spend the next 15 years incarcerated, removed from society, unable to access any other children. For Anne, the sentence provided a measure of justice and finality, but it also marked the beginning of a longer, more complicated journey. The journey of helping their children heal from the trauma that's presence and actions had inflicted. That journey would be measured not in months or even years, but in the slow, incremental rebuilding of trust, safety, and the restoration of childhood joy that had been stolen. 3 years after that fateful September afternoon when Sophia encountered Rex the German Shepherd, the Martinez family gathered in their living room for what had become a monthly tradition. A family meeting where everyone shared their feelings, their accomplishments, and their ongoing struggles. Sophia, now 6 years old, was about to enter 1st grade. She still attended therapy with Doctor, though the sessions had become less frequent as her emotional wounds gradually healed. Now 11, was in 5th grade, and had become something of an unexpected advocate for child protection within his school community. Sophia had progressed remarkably through her healing journey. The nightmares had largely ceased. The flinching response to unexpected touch had almost completely disappeared. She developed a cautious but genuine joy in childhood activities, playing with friends, participating in dance classes, creating art projects. She would never entirely forget what had happened to her, but she was learning to integrate that trauma into her larger life story rather than allowing it to define her entirely. Doctor had recently suggested that they transition to quarterly sessions rather than monthly ones, a milestone that, and celebrated as evidence of their daughter's resilience. This journey had been more complicated in some ways. While Sophia had the advantage of being very young, her brain still developing, her memory less precise, carried the full cognitive weight of what he'd witnessed and the burden he'd carried in silence. Yet he'd channeled that experience into something meaningful. He'd begun speaking at his school about recognizing warning signs of abuse. He'd worked with school counselors to develop presentations for other children about what to do if they or their siblings were being hurt. His teachers remarked on his emotional maturity and his unusual empathy toward other children who seemed to be struggling. In his personal therapy sessions, had gradually processed his guilt and his heroism. Dr. Martinez had helped him understand that while his coaching of Sophia had been extraordinary, he shouldn't carry responsibility for the abuse itself. He was a child who had done everything he could with the limited power and resources available to him. His role now, as he moved into adolescence, was to channel his experience into continued advocacy and to allow himself to simply be a child, to have fun, to develop his own interests without always being defined by what had happened. The police dog Rex had become something of a neighborhood celebrity. Officer James had continued his work with the K-9 unit, but he and Rex had also become fixtures at community events throughout Phoenix. They visited schools, participated in demonstrations, and spoke at victim advocacy conferences about the role of law enforcement in child protection. Officer had remained in touch with the Martinez family, checking in occasionally, and he'd become something of a quiet mentor too. There was something powerful about interacting with the man and dog, whose presence had ultimately saved his sister's life. The case itself had prompted systemic changes throughout Phoenix and Arizona more broadly. Detective Maria had partnered with child advocacy organizations to develop improved screening protocols for child protective services. She'd presented at state conferences about the importance of interagency communication and the dangerous gaps that existed in the current system. Her work had led to the implementation of a new statewide database that allowed pediatricians, teachers, social workers, and law enforcement to flag concerning patterns across multiple agencies, exactly the kind of tool that might have identified concerns about Sophia's welfare sooner. The Arizona Department of Child Safety had revised its training programs for social workers, emphasizing the importance of recognizing subtle signs of abuse and understanding how abusers manipulate families and exploit trust. A new requirement was implemented requiring home visits for any individual with a prior history of concerning behavior toward children, regardless of how old the prior accusation might be. It wasn't a perfect system, no system could be, but it represented meaningful progress toward better protection for vulnerable children. School districts throughout the Phoenix area had implemented new mandatory training for teachers and staff about recognizing signs of child abuse. Sophia's preschool teacher, who had noted concerning behavioral changes but hadn't formally documented them, had become an advocate for better protocols. She worked with other educators to develop a standardized checklist of warning signs and clear procedures for reporting suspected abuse. The culture of hesitation, where teachers worried about overstepping, about interfering in family matters, was gradually shifting toward a culture of accountability where any concern about a child's welfare was considered worthy of investigation. Had taken a leave of absence from her nursing job to focus on her family's healing. When she eventually returned to work, she transitioned to a different role within Joseph's Hospital. She now worked as a patient advocate for families dealing with trauma and abuse. Her intimate knowledge of the system's failures and her personal experience with trauma had made her uniquely qualified to help other families navigate the complex intersection of medical care, social services, and mental health support. She'd become a voice for institutional change within the hospital system, advocating for better screening protocols and mandatory reporting procedures. Had processed his trauma partly through his faith community. The family attended a church that had implemented a new child protection policy after learning about what had happened to the Martinez family. Had become involved in developing better background check procedures and creating a culture of accountability within the church community, because abuse thrived in organizations where leadership prioritized reputation protection over actual child safety. His work was quiet but significant, affecting how dozens of organizations in Phoenix approached child protection. The Martinez family had also become involved in a larger advocacy organization called Voices for Safe Children, a nonprofit dedicated to preventing child abuse and supporting survivors, and had shared their story publicly, initially reluctantly, but increasingly with purpose. They understood that their willingness to speak about their family's trauma could help other families, could raise awareness, could facilitate change. Sophia and had also participated in age-appropriate ways, sharing their experiences with educators and advocates in settings that were carefully controlled to protect their privacy and emotional safety. 5 years after that September afternoon, Sophia stood on the stage of her elementary school's auditorium, 6 years old, having grown into an 8-year-old with recovered childhood joy and remarkable resilience. She was performing in a school play, nothing particularly significant, a small role in a third-grade production. But for watching her daughter perform, watching Sophia smile and take her bow, represented something almost miraculous. This was a child who had been victimized, who had experienced trauma that no child should ever experience, yet who had survived and was thriving. Now 13, sat in the audience next to his parents, and he was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of seeing his sister flourish. He'd spent nearly 2 years coaching Sophia to say, "Help me," living in constant fear, carrying impossible burdens. Now, watching his sister smile on stage, he understood that his sacrifice and courage had mattered. His sister's survival, her healing, her joy, these were the ultimate validation of his heroism. Detective Maria attended the play as well. She sat in the back of the auditorium in civilian clothes, watching the Martinez family celebrate their daughter's achievement. She'd left the K-9 unit and now worked as a special investigator for the Arizona Department of Child Safety, focusing specifically on improving investigation protocols and helping other families. She thought about Sophia often, about that terrifying moment when a small girl had locked eyes with a police dog and spoken 2 words that had changed everything. She thought about the countless children who didn't get rescued, whose cries for help went unheard, whose abusers went unpunished. She thought about the work that still remained to be done. The story of Sophia and the police dog had become something of an urban legend in Phoenix, a story that was told and retold, adapted and refined, a narrative about trauma and resilience and the power of children's voices to create change. Some versions emphasized the drama of the police action, others focused on heroic coaching. Some highlighted officers' role in recognizing the deeper issue beneath the surface chaos. But regardless of the version, the core message remained constant. A 3-year-old girl had found her voice in the most unexpected moment, and that voice had set in motion a chain of events that had not only saved her life, but had contributed to systemic changes that would protect countless other children. Often reflected on that perfect Saturday morning before everything changed, on the yellow butterfly dress, on Sophia's humming, on the peaceful watering of flowers. She couldn't return to that innocence, couldn't unknow what had happened to her daughter. But she'd learned to exist in the space between trauma and recovery, holding both the pain of what had been lost and the gratitude for what had been preserved and rebuilt. Her family had been broken, shattered into pieces that seemed irreparable. But through time, therapy, love, and the support of a community that ultimately believed in them and protected them, they had become whole again. Not the same as before, but whole nonetheless, stronger in their brokenness, more compassionate in their survival, more committed to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to endure what they had endured.